Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're tracing the history of one of humanity's most unglamorous miracles, the toilet. From the first mud brick drains to the invention of the flush, every empire rose and fell on its plumbing. Before we start this journey, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. The first toilets belonged to the first cities, and the first cities rose in Mesopotamia, that wide stretch of river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates, where mud became both building material and metaphor. When people stopped wandering and began stacking bricks, they built walls faster than they built drains, and the results were immediate. The same fertile floods that nourished the fields also swelled the ditches and courtyards, leaving behind what every city produces best: waste. Civilization's earliest citizens woke each morning to the smell of themselves. In places like Uruk, Ur and Lagash, the idea of hygiene was communal by necessity. Thousands of people crowded together in baked brick houses, their floors caked with silt, their courtyards alive with goats and smoke. When it came time to relieve themselves, there was no ceremony. A corner, a pit, or the street itself would do. Archaeologists call this open defecation. The Sumerians would have called it life. But as the cities grew, so did the piles. The logic of survival changed. Wandering tribes could always move on from their own filth. Urban dwellers could not. The moment humanity stopped to build, it also had to learn how to clean. The earliest Mesopotamian toilets were little more than pits lined with clay rings or reed baskets buried in the earth. A seated position was optional. What mattered was containment, and ideally, that someone else's property lay downhill. Archaeologists have found fragments of drains dating to around 3000 BCE, baked clay pipes running from houses into narrow street channels. These were among the world's first known sanitation systems, designed not for comfort, but for survival. It was one of humanity's great logistical achievements, proof that the collective problem of waste could be solved with geometry. There is a kind of practical poetry in those ancient drains. Each one relied on slope, gravity, and faith that what went in would never come back. The waste flowed into open gutters that followed the same logic as irrigation ditches. The water of life going one way, the water of death another. The system worked best when people agreed on the same direction. It was crude, but it marked a turning point. When Sumerians built temples to their gods, they also built drains beneath them. Sanctity, it seemed, required plumbing. By the time the Indus Valley cities appeared farther east, the experiment had become an art form. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were not just settlements, but designed organisms. Their streets ran in precise grids, their houses fitted with small bathing rooms, paved in brick, each one draining into covered channels along the road. These drains connected to soak pits that trapped solid waste before letting grey water flow outward, a design still recognisable in modern sewers. In the Indus world, sanitation was not an afterthought, it was the skeleton of the city. The grid itself was a declaration that order could conquer chaos. Every home, rich or poor, participated in the same network. Archaeologists have found no palaces, no monumental temples, only infrastructure, an equality built in baked clay. The people of the Indus did not decorate their drains, but they maintained them meticulously. They understood that a clean city was not an aesthetic preference. It was proof of collective intelligence. What's striking is how civic this achievement was. In Mesopotamia, sanitation had been improvised. In the Indus, it was institutional. Cleanliness was a function of the city, not of personal virtue. The streets were the bloodstream, the drains its veins, and every house contributed to the same circulatory system. Civilization had learned that hygiene was not about the individual body, but about the shared one. It was the first time in history that waste management became a public good, and perhaps the first time that citizens could take their own cleanliness for granted. When the Indus civilization declined around 1900 BCE, its drains clogged and its streets silenced. Whatever political or environmental disaster ended it, their sewers endured longer than their language. Archaeologists who rediscovered them found more evidence of maintenance than of monarchy, a reminder that civic order often outlives the rulers who claimed to impose it. Where the people of the Indus and Sumer had treated sanitation as civic management, the Egyptians turned it into theology. For them, hygiene was not merely practical, it was moral, a daily rehearsal of cosmic balance. The Egyptian word for that balance was ma'at, the principle of order that governed everything from the movement of the stars to the honesty of the marketplace. In Egypt, purity upheld the universe. To bathe, to launder, to keep a house in good repair was to participate in the maintenance of Ma'at itself. Dirt and disorder were symptoms of Isfet, the chaos that threatened to unmake the world. Where Mesopotamia built clay drains to separate the clean from the unclean, Egypt sought to transform filth into harmony through ritual. This belief began at the river. The Nile was at once water supply, highway, washing basin, and sacred boundary. It nourished the crops, received offerings, and absorbed refuse without judgment. Egyptians bathed in it daily, washed clothes on its banks, and used its water for purification rites before prayer. When waste and washing flowed together, it did not feel contradictory. The Nile was a mediator, endlessly renewing what it touched. Flood and drought were moral events, reflections of the people's collective alignment with Ma'at. Within homes, sanitation took modest but effective forms. Most Egyptians used simple clay or alabaster pots, lined with sand, which absorbed moisture and odour before being emptied into designated waste areas outside the settlement. The desert's dryness did the rest. For the wealthy, comfort found refinement in material rather than method. Limestone seats, carved with care and fitted over containers of sand, were status symbols as much as furnishings. They embodied both utility and the Egyptian obsession with permanence, waste managed through geometry and patience. Soap as such did not exist, but the Egyptians found their own chemistry. Natron, a naturally occurring soda ash, harvested from dry lake beds, became the universal cleanser. Mixed with oil or crushed herbs, it scoured skin, cloth, and temple floors alike. Its sharp scent became synonymous with piety. Embalmers used natron to preserve bodies. Priests used it to purify themselves before worship. In both cases, the goal was the same: to protect the sacred from decay. Cleanliness was not a matter of appearance, but of ontology, the difference between what endured and what spoiled. Bathing was habitual and hierarchical. Priests shaved their heads and bodies to remove any trace of impurity, washing several times a day in basins of cool water drawn from the river. Labourers washed after work to rinse off dust and appease both heat and conscience. Even the dead were subject to these expectations. The embalming process was the ultimate purification. The body cleansed of corruption so that the soul could join the gods. The hygienic and the spiritual were one continuous act. Perfumed oils, cosmetics, and incense blurred the line between cleanliness and beauty. Kohl eyeliner reduced glare and warded off infection. Cones of scented fat melted slowly on wigs during feasts, releasing fragrance that masked sweat and smoke. What looked like vanity was maintenance of body, of order, of ma'at. Egyptian art depicts this self-care with serenity. Men and women, anointed, composed, and symmetrical. Even in leisure, the act of keeping oneself clean and perfumed reaffirmed one's alignment with the cosmos. Urban waste was handled with the same pragmatic reverence. Garbage heaps were piled beyond city walls, exposed to the sun and wind that would sterilize them. The desert was not seen as hostile, but as part of the system, an endless, absorbent surface that received what the river could not. Refuse, ashes, and even human waste dried quickly, purified by heat and time. It was a cycle the Egyptians trusted completely. The landscape itself was their sanitation infrastructure, a self-regulating balance of elements. This environmental partnership made Egypt uniquely stable. While other ancient civilizations battled plague, Egypt's arid climate and ritual discipline helped keep disease in check. Order and cleanliness were linked not just by faith, but by epidemiology. The habits of washing, shaving, and offering to the gods doubled as practical public health measures. The priests who bathed out of devotion also reduced infection. The sand that absorbed waste also prevented rot. Ma'at, it turned out, was hygienic. It is tempting to call all this superstition, but that misses the point. Egyptian sanitation worked because it was embedded in meaning. Their system succeeded not through engineering, but through worldview. The Nile cleansed, the desert sterilized, the people obeyed the rhythm. Every action, from pouring water over one's hands to emptying a household pot, reinforced a sense of participation in something larger. Cleanliness was civilization, scaled to the cosmos. Even waste obeyed hierarchy. The elite had servants who emptied and replaced sand. The poor emptied their own. Yet all contributed to the same order, a seamless chain of maintenance connecting the palace, the village, and the tomb. Egypt's brilliance lay in its integration, the sacred and the mundane woven into a single, dust-free fabric. This unity made the civilization remarkably resilient. When others built fortifications, Egypt built continuity. From a modern perspective, their sanitation seems primitive. Sand instead of sewage, ritual instead of plumbing. Yet its efficiency rested on humility. The Egyptians did not try to conquer filth. They accepted its place within creation. They trusted that the same forces that created decay would remove it again. Theirs was the first truly sustainable sanitation system, powered by belief and climate, rather than pipes and pumps. Egypt's contribution to the history of toilets was not mechanical innovation, but moral transformation. They turned hygiene into ethics. To keep the body clean was to respect the divine pattern. Even the act of relieving oneself participated in the great balance of Ma'at. What left the body returned to the earth, purified by sand and sun. In this sense, every pot was an altar, every jar a small cosmology of order restored. The ideas of cleanliness and moral balance that travelled north from Egypt found a new home in Greece, though not always a comfortable one. Where the Egyptians sanctified hygiene, the Greeks intellectualized it. They debated purity as a metaphor, not a municipal policy. By the 5th century BCE, Athens stood as the shining centre of the Mediterranean world, a city of marble, mathematics, and the occasional puddle of human waste. In a place that celebrated order and proportion, sanitation was the one subject left unsolved, or perhaps ignored. Morning in Athens began with the sound of washing. Servants swept courtyards, rinsed marble floors, and poured water over the gutters that ran along narrow streets. These gutters carried away dust, ashes, and refuse from the previous night's cooking fires. They also carried something less respectable. For all the sophistication of Greek architecture and public life, urban sanitation was improvised at best. Many homes relied on chamber pots emptied into the nearest drain or alley. Some streets were paved, but most remained packed earth, absorbing the runoff of human and animal traffic. In hot weather, the result was memorable. Athens did have public latrines, simple stone benches with holes carved above shallow drains that were periodically rinsed by water from nearby fountains or cisterns. These facilities were meant for men and slaves. Women's access was usually confined to the home. Privacy was a modern luxury. The Greek word for toilet didn't exist in quite the way we understand it. Relief was communal, conversation casual, and cleanliness situational. The same culture that gave us geometry and tragedy treated sanitation as a matter of convenience, not virtue. Domestic arrangements were little better. Wealthy households might have small rooms designated for washing or defecation, but most people relied on clay pots or buckets, emptied at dawn into the street or a dump outside the city walls. The smell of ammonia hung over the workshops of tanners and fullers who collected urine for processing leather and bleaching cloth. Waste was currency for industry, the city's informal recycling system. If the Egyptians turned hygiene into theology, the Greeks turned excretion into economics. Public baths existed, though they served more as social hubs than instruments of sanitation. Small bathing facilities attached to gymnasia allowed men to rinse after exercise, and larger establishments offered a combination of relaxation and gossip. The water was often tepid, the floors slick with oil and dirt from repeated use. To bathe was not to cleanse the body so much as to perform a civic ritual, to exist temporarily in a space where conversation flowed as freely as the drains rarely did. When Greek writers praised the virtues of moderation and self-control, they meant temperance of appetite, not an aversion to filth. This contradiction defined much of Greek culture. Philosophers extolled the beauty of the human form while warning against indulgence. Plato and Aristotle wrote of harmony, the perfect balance of reason and flesh, yet both assumed that the management of bodily functions was beneath philosophical consideration. The ideal citizen lived in the mind, not the stomach. Even medicine, so advanced under Hippocrates and his successors, focused on internal balance rather than external hygiene. Disease was an imbalance of humours, not the result of standing water or contaminated streets. The body's interior became a metaphor for the state, order within, chaos without. The Greeks were also pioneers in aesthetic paradox. Their temples were masterpieces of proportion, their cities models of civic life, and yet their waste disposal remained an afterthought. In some districts, rain washed debris through open channels that doubled as sewers. In others, refuse simply accumulated until removed by labourers. Archaeologists have found traces of drains beneath a few houses, but they were exceptions. The great Athenian democracy that debated virtue daily left sanitation largely to slaves, wind, and the occasional flood. For a people obsessed with symmetry, they left hygiene to chance. Part of this neglect came from geography. Greece lacked the predictable floods of the Nile or the broad rivers of Mesopotamia. Its mountains fractured the landscape into small basins and isolated plains. Each city managed its water supply independently, relying on wells, cisterns, and aqueducts that served only the essentials. Waste disposal simply didn't inspire the same architectural ambition. The Greeks engineered fountains for beauty, not drainage for necessity. Their cities were meant to please the eye, not the nose. Culturally, modesty complicated the matter. Greek art celebrated the nude body, but Greek manners insisted on restraint. To be seen washing or relieving oneself was a breach of decorum. That tension between display and denial ran through every aspect of Greek life. They could sculpt perfection in marble, but preferred not to discuss what that perfection did after dinner. Their literature treated filth as comedy or tragedy, seldom as policy. Aristophanes made scatological humour a civic art form. Sophocles turned disease into divine punishment. Between the joke and the omen, there was little room for plumbing. Despite this ambivalence, Greek sanitation wasn't entirely primitive. Excavations in Athens and Corinth reveal that some wealthier neighbourhoods had rudimentary sewer channels beneath the streets. These early systems, built of stone or clay, collected runoff from rain and household drains, but they were limited in reach and maintenance. Without regular flushing, they clogged quickly, leaving stench and insects as familiar companions. Clean water and waste removal never formed a unified infrastructure. The intellectual cradle of the Western world lived with both brilliance and bacteria. To the Greeks, however, cleanliness was less about engineering than about ethos. The Delphic command to know thyself did not extend to knowing what happened to the contents of one's chamber pot. Sanitation was considered a matter of habit, not virtue. When Aristotle wrote about the ideal polis, he described its walls, its constitution, its laws, but never its drains. It was the philosopher's blind spot, the assumption that civic order began in the assembly, not under the floorboards. Still, there was a certain democratic honesty in Greek filth. No class, however exalted, could entirely escape the smell of the city. Wealth afforded slightly better arrangements, but waste found its way downhill. The same streets that hosted processions of philosophers and poets were periodically sluiced with buckets from upper windows. Visitors complained of the odour. Athenians considered it a fact of life. Civilization was a conversation held over the sound of someone else's runoff. In the end, Greek sanitation reflected Greek philosophy, rational, articulate, and selective. They mastered the abstract but tolerated the unpleasant. Their genius was intellectual containment, not hydraulic control. The streets of Athens glittered with ideas and sewage alike, proof that brilliance and neglect can coexist quite comfortably. For a people who worshipped order, they lived remarkably well with chaos. Where the Greeks built beauty and debated virtue, the Romans built pipes. They inherited philosophy from their predecessors, but applied it to masonry, not metaphysics. Under Rome's streets, water moved as reliably as law. Above them, the constant sound of running water filled the city's background hum, flowing through lead pipes that glimmered faintly when the sun caught the fountains. It was the heartbeat of empire, a steady, engineered pulse that carried civilization itself downhill. Roman sanitation was less invention than ambition. They took the ideas of drains and ditches that had existed for millennia and magnified them into infrastructure. The aqueducts remain their most visible triumph, stone channels stretching for miles, carrying fresh water from distant hills into the city's fountains, baths and homes. Gravity did most of the work. Geometry did the rest. Water cascaded through arches and tunnels with mathematical precision, filling cisterns that fed an urban population of more than 1 million. The system worked so well that it made abundance feel ordinary. Rome's citizens could draw clean water for cooking, washing, and even flushing, something no other city had yet achieved. All that water needed somewhere to go. The answer was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, one of the oldest and most enduring pieces of engineering in human history. Originally a drainage ditch built by the Etruscans to reclaim swampy land, it grew into a vast underground river of stone and brick. By the 1st century BCE, it connected every corner of the city, carrying runoff, waste, and stormwater into the Tiber. The flow was constant, cleansing by momentum alone. When later poets called Rome eternal, they were speaking as much of its plumbing as its politics. Beneath the marble forums and temples, the empire's bowels ran ceaselessly, unseen but indispensable. Above ground, Sanitation became a social activity. Roman latrines were public, crowded, and cheerfully unprivate. Long benches of marble or stone lined the walls, each perforated with evenly spaced holes. Beneath them, channels of running water kept the system flushed, while a small trough at the front held water for cleaning the communal sponge, attached to a stick and shared by everyone. Archaeologists still debate how hygienic this was, but the Romans seemed unbothered. They were a pragmatic people. If it worked, it was civilized. Privacy was considered antisocial. The same citizens who debated politics in the forum could continue their arguments uninterrupted in the latrine. The design of these public facilities was both efficient and absurdly elegant. Some latrines featured mosaic floors and frescoed walls, evidence that even the most utilitarian spaces deserved art. The constant trickle of water muffled conversation and odour alike, a kind of hydraulic white noise. Here, senators, soldiers, and merchants sat side by side, equal before the needs of nature. It was democracy by necessity, class distinctions briefly dissolved by plumbing. In a sense, the Romans built the world's first truly public toilets, because they were the world's first true urbanites. When you pack 1 million people into close quarters, privacy becomes less important than throughput. The Romans approached cleanliness as a collective performance. The great public baths, Caracalla, Trajan, Diocletian, were architectural symphonies of water and stone, sustained by the same aqueducts that fed the sewers. Bathing was not a private ritual, but a daily routine, part recreation, part social obligation. Citizens bathed, exercised, ate, and conducted business there. The baths included hot rooms, cold plunges, and even libraries, all connected by intricate plumbing that kept temperatures regulated and pools replenished. Wastewater drained directly into the sewers, ensuring constant circulation. The entire city functioned like an organism. Water in, water out, everything flowing with purpose. Even in smaller towns, the Roman obsession with order extended to sanitation. Archaeological sites from Britain to North Africa reveal miniature versions of the same system. Aqueducts feeding fountains, latrines connected to underground drains, baths warmed by hippocausts, stone floors heated from below by fire. Romanization often meant plumbing before politics. Conquered peoples might resent taxation, but they rarely refused running water. A bathhouse could do more to pacify a province than a legion. Of course, there were costs. The lead pipes that carried Rome's water were both marvel and menace. Plumbers? The word itself comes from plumbum, Latin for lead, lined entire districts with gleaming conduits that slowly poisoned their users. The Romans never connected their periodic epidemics and strange ailments to their infrastructure. The rich suffered most, their private homes equipped with ornate but toxic plumbing. The empire had built comfort faster than understanding. The irony of Roman sanitation is that it was both advanced and indifferent. The system worked not because anyone understood hygiene, but because they valued spectacle and convenience. The same drains that carried away waste also flushed the blood from sacrifices and the runoff from markets. Disease still spread, but at least the city looked clean. The baths, constantly refilled, were often warm enough for bacteria to thrive, yet no one questioned their virtue. Inscriptions praising the builders of aqueducts and sewers survive in marble. No one carved the name of the first man to notice a rash. Still, there is something admirable in Rome's audacity. They confronted the physical reality of urban life without embarrassment. Instead of hiding their waste, they monumentalized its management. Sanitation was a form of patriotism. Clean streets and running fountains proclaimed the empire's competence. Visitors from less developed regions must have seen the flowing water as proof that Rome had domesticated nature itself. The city's smell, part damp stone, part iron, part humanity, was the scent of mastery. Roman engineers treated water as a civic instrument. They calculated gradients with uncanny precision, ensuring that gravity alone powered the entire system. Maintenance crews descended into the sewers to clear blockages, an unpleasant but respected task. The Cloaca Maxima still functions in part today, 2 millennia later, a monument less to marble grandeur than to the mathematics of slope. Where other civilizations built monuments to gods, Rome built them to flow rates. It was the same faith, expressed in cubic meters per second. For all its sophistication, though, Roman sanitation never fully conquered the city's contradictions. The Tiber remained both artery and dump. Waste from slaughterhouses, baths, and latrines flowed together, turning the river into a mirror of Rome's dual nature. Clean water in, corruption out. The system depended entirely on constant maintenance and constant water. Without both, it failed immediately. Rome's cleanliness was an illusion of movement. As long as the water ran, everything looked pure. After Rome fell, and its engineered grace gave way to rubble, the Middle Ages inherited both its ruins and its smell. Civilization had survived, but plumbing had not. For centuries, sanitation became a negotiation between endurance and indifference. Yet even in this improvised world, people adapted. They learned to move waste with nothing more than stone, wood, and gravity, and to live with odours that no sermon could disguise. What emerged was a patchwork of medieval solutions, some clever, some horrifying, all unmistakably human. In castles, the most recognisable invention was the garderobe, a polite term for a hole in the wall. The word originally meant wardrobe, and for good reason. Some sources suggest that many of these small stone closets doubled as clothing storage, because people believed that the foul air would repel moths. A garderobe typically projected outward from the castle wall in a narrow tower, its opening dropping straight into the void. Waste fell down a vertical shaft to a pit, moat, or hillside below. There were no traps, valves, or lids, just the mercy of distance and airflow. In winter, the draught was brutal. In summer, the smell rose back like a ghost. Yet compared to chamber pots or open ditches, this simple use of gravity was progress. Large castles had multiple guardrobes arranged in vertical stacks, allowing several floors to share the same chute. Wealthy lords might even boast a guardrobe tower, a modest architectural status symbol, proof that one's waste travelled farther than anyone else's. But these systems needed tending. The accumulation of years, siege conditions, or simple neglect could turn a cesspit into a hazard. The organic brew beneath some castles was said to bubble in warm weather. Periodically, someone had to remove it. That task fell to the gong farmers, also known as nightmen or gong scourers. The word gong comes from Old English for going, and their job was exactly that, to deal with what everyone else had gone and left behind. By lantern light, they climbed down into cesspits, armed with buckets, shovels, and prayer. They scraped, scooped, and hauled the sludge into carts, then dumped it outside town or sold it as fertilizer. It was hard, dangerous work. Cesspits sometimes collapsed, releasing deadly fumes of methane and ammonia. Still, the pay was better than most labouring trades. The only real cost was dignity and occasionally consciousness. Towns faced their own challenges. Narrow medieval streets were essentially open sewers, carrying runoff and refuse toward the nearest stream. Residents emptied chamber pots into gutters, and the waste of entire neighbourhoods accumulated in ditches that doubled as drainage channels. Some towns employed labourers to clear the filth, others relied on pigs to do it for them. A few cities attempted rudimentary regulation, fining citizens who dumped from upper windows, at the wrong hour. The results were mixed. Travellers often remarked on the smell of Europe before they saw its cathedrals. The same gravity that powered castle garderobes also defined urban sanitation. Privies perched over rivers were common. In coastal towns, tides handled the flushing. Wealthier homes sometimes built indoor latrines that dropped into contained pits, but the technology never advanced beyond vertical logic. What went down stayed down until a gong farmer came for it. Medieval sanitation functioned less as a system than as an ongoing truce with decomposition. The goal wasn't cleanliness, it was containment. The contrast with the Islamic world could not have been sharper. While Europe relied on gravity and resignation, the cities of the Middle East and Al-Andalus advanced a different kind of cleanliness, one powered by hydraulics and faith. The Quran's emphasis on ritual washing shaped an entire infrastructure of hygiene. Mosques incorporated fountains and basins for ablution. Households featured small latrines with water for flushing and cleaning. Engineers in Damascus, Baghdad, and Cordoba built sophisticated systems of aqueducts, pipes, and cisterns that distributed water throughout cities. The palace of Madinat al-Zahra near Cordoba had running water, tiled drains, and perfumed baths centuries before most of Europe rediscovered the concept of plumbing. For Muslims, water was not just a resource but a requirement. Purity was a prerequisite for prayer, and prayer structured daily life. Cleanliness was thus woven into civic design. Fountains at mosque courtyards, public baths funded by endowments, drains that kept streets passable in heat and rain alike. The technology combined ancient Roman principles with Islamic innovation, achieving what Europe would not manage again until the Renaissance, a steady, pressurized water supply feeding both luxury and necessity. The cities glistened with fountains and tiled hammams, where washing was both physical and spiritual renewal. Faith united the medieval world, but water divided it. The same centuries that saw Europe's cesspits ferment also witnessed Islamic gardens cooled by irrigation and marble basins. Geography played a part. Arid climates demanded discipline, but so did belief. To wash before meeting God required engineering that Europe's theologians had not yet rediscovered. The contrast was not lost on travellers. Crusaders who entered the cities of the Levant marvelled at their plumbing and perfumed baths. They brought back many things from those wars. Hygiene was not one of them. Back in Europe, sanitation remained a local improvisation, rarely a public service. Each fortress or town was an island of its own solutions, surrounded by the memory of Rome's lost perfection and the rumour of the East's marvels. Yet within the same walls that tolerated waste and disease, a quieter revolution was taking place. In monasteries tucked behind cloisters and stone gardens, some communities refused decay altogether. These monks, armed with discipline, scripture, and rudimentary hydraulics, would find in sanitation not vanity but salvation. They believed that purity of soul began with purity of surroundings, and their plumbing, humble though it was, became the first light of order in a darkening age. Monks lived by the rule of Saint Benedict, which prescribed prayer, labour and study in a precise rotation that allowed little room for decay of any kind. Cleanliness here was not luxury, it was obedience made visible. Monastic life was built around rhythm, bells marking the hours, prayers dividing the day, and water flowing quietly through cloisters to make everything else possible. The same discipline that governed worship shaped engineering. The brothers of Cluny, Citeaux, and countless smaller abbeys learned to read not just scripture, but hydraulics. They diverted nearby streams to turn mills, irrigate gardens, and wash away waste. Their drains ran beneath dormitories and kitchens, feeding both sanitation and agriculture. The technology was simple: gravity, stone channels, and steady maintenance, but the effect was profound. Each abbey functioned as a miniature city, self-cleaning by design. One of the most ingenious features of these complexes was the reredoter, the communal latrine block attached to dormitories. It was usually built above a stream or an artificial watercourse so that waste would be carried away naturally. Wooden seats lined a long bench, the constant flow of water below served as both drainage and deodorizer. To modern eyes it looks crude, but compared with the garderobes of castles or the cesspits of towns, it was architectural mercy. The monks might have lived in poverty, but their plumbing bordered on enlightenment. The sound of moving water accompanied their silence, a background hymn of utility. Elsewhere in the monastery, channels and conduits distributed fresh water to kitchens, breweries, and washhouses. Some abbeys, like Fountains and Rievaulx in England, built elaborate networks of aqueducts and settling tanks. They filtered water through layers of gravel before directing it into reservoirs, ensuring that each section of the community had a dedicated supply. Wastewater from baths and laundries flowed outward to irrigate gardens and fields, closing the loop between purity and productivity. It was sustainability centuries before the word existed. The monks saw this not as innovation, but as discipline, part of the same order that kept their manuscripts straight and their souls aligned. Their commitment to cleanliness extended beyond plumbing. Monastic regulations prescribed regular bathing, laundering, and even hair washing, though always in moderation. Dirt was distraction, a reminder of the flesh's rebellion against order. The act of washing one's hands before prayer or meal was ritualized into humility. What in Rome had been luxury became here a form of penance. To cleanse was to acknowledge imperfection. The abbey's water systems were not statements of wealth but of restraint, mechanical reflections of a spiritual control. In the larger history of sanitation, the monasteries were accidental engineers. Their drains and watercourses anticipated the sewer networks of later cities. Visitors often marvelled at how such austere communities achieved such comfort without indulgence. Yet nothing was wasted, not water, not effort, not time. The same mind that calculated prayer intervals calculated flow rates. Prayer schedules and plumbing diagrams were written in the same hand. Outside the cloister walls, Europe still stank of stagnation, but within them ran the faint pulse of continuity. The monks preserved more than theology, they preserved technique. When later generations rediscovered hydraulics, they found much of it already practiced in these quiet enclaves. The monastic ideal, cleanliness through order, sanctity through system, became the forgotten ancestor of civic hygiene. Eventually, even these sanctuaries would falter. Wars, reformations, and the slow drift of wealth towards cities emptied many cloisters of their careful routines. The water channels silted over, the reredorters dried, and the silence that remained was less holy than abandoned, but their example endured. The Renaissance arrived not with the scent of roses, but with the sharp tang of neglect. Civilization had rediscovered the arts, mathematics, and the human form, but not the infrastructure required to keep any of them clean. Towns that had once been small and tolerable swelled into centres of trade and culture, their populations multiplying faster than their drainage. The result was beauty wrapped around decay, frescoes painted over a stench no amount of marble could disguise. The new cities glittered from a distance. Florence, Venice, and Paris grew into architectural statements of optimism. Narrow medieval alleys widened into avenues lined with carved facades and fountains, symbols of prosperity and taste. Yet behind those facades, waste still trickled through open gutters, and the fountains often drew water from the same sources that received the sewage. Citizens dressed in silk and velvet picked their way through puddles of runoff. careful not to stain their shoes. The Renaissance perfected perspective, but ignored depth. Its artists could paint the illusion of cleanliness without enduring the reality of it. Among the wealthy, sanitation reverted to ceremony. Chamber pots, often made of silver or porcelain, were emptied discreetly by servants into courtyards or cesspits. Houses lacked plumbing, but they had etiquette. The noble's privacy relied on the invisibility of others, the unseen hands that carried filth away under cover of darkness. In palaces, perfumed oils, rosewater, and incense masked the inevitable. Courtiers wore scented gloves and carried pomanders, small metal orbs filled with herbs and ambergris, to battle the air. To smell sweet was not just fashion, but self-defense. The nose became the barometer of class. The poor endured the world as it was. The rich tried to outwit it through fragrance. Public life was equally fragrant in theory and fetid in practice. Theatres, markets, and churches overflowed with bodies pressed close in heat and unwashed linen. Visitors wrote of the contradiction. Cities adorned with sculpture and music, yet surrounded by refuse. Bathing, once a mark of monastic discipline, had become suspect again. Some moralists warned that water weakened the body and tempted sin. The baths of earlier centuries fell into ruin, their mosaics buried under rubbish heaps or converted into storehouses. Cleanliness, like pagan learning, was rediscovered selectively. Nowhere was the irony clearer than in Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. Between sketches of flying machines and anatomical diagrams, he drew plans for an ideal city, streets broad enough for air to circulate, elevated walkways to separate pedestrians from waste, and a network of covered drains that would carry away filth unseen. It was a vision centuries ahead of its time, an architect's attempt to reconcile beauty with hygiene. Yet his contemporaries preferred cathedrals to sewers. Leonardo's city remained a fantasy on parchment, a dream of reason smothered by the sweet smell of denial. The Renaissance rediscovered humanity, but not the drain. The practical realities of daily life rarely matched the intellectual triumphs. Scholars copied Galen and Aristotle, yet few applied the same curiosity to their own water supply. Physicians advised against bathing too often, claiming that water opened the pores to miasma. Bad air believed to carry disease. The result was a culture both refined and rank, in which people powdered their wigs over unwashed scalps and doused themselves in floral distillations extracted by alchemists. Cities became experiments in olfactory diplomacy. Each class developed its own signature scent: the musk of the merchant, the lavender of the noble, the smoke of the poor. Renaissance sanitation was, in essence, a form of performance. Municipal ordinances ordered streets to be swept and waste carted away, but enforcement lagged behind aspiration. Cesspits overflowed beneath houses, ditches clogged with refuse until they caught fire from the fermenting gases. The technology existed to do better: basic drainage, water wheels, even siphons. But civic pride preferred marble fountains that looked clean to pipes that actually were. To keep up appearances was the governing principle of the age. The Renaissance admired form over function in everything, even in its waste. Perfume became the invisible architecture that held society together. Apothecaries blended fragrances with the seriousness of engineers, and patrons funded the art of scent as they did painting. Plague masks with beak-like noses were stuffed with herbs to filter the air, turning fear into fashion. In royal courts, entire rooms were scented with burning spices. The body became a portable cathedral of odour, consecrated daily against the atmosphere outside. If the Middle Ages had prayed for salvation, the Renaissance sprayed for it. The contrast with the Islamic world persisted. While European cities waged their olfactory war, Palaces in Al-Andalus and Istanbul still enjoyed running water and tiled baths. The relationship between faith and hygiene that had defined Islamic urbanism continued to sustain its cities long after Christendom abandoned the habit. Travellers from the West admired these amenities, but regarded them as exotic luxuries, not lessons. Cleanliness was treated as cultural decoration rather than an achievement worth imitating. Beneath the glitter of humanism, Europe's plumbing remained medieval. Rivers carried both drinking water and disease, cesspits leaked into wells, and epidemics reminded the populace that beauty offered no protection. Yet the Renaissance clung to the illusion of improvement. Architects rebuilt entire cities after fires or floods without correcting their drainage. They placed statues over fountains, not filters beneath them. The ideal of order existed only at eye level. Still, the idea of a cleaner world never entirely vanished. Leonardo's imaginary city would linger in the European imagination like a ghost blueprint. A few thinkers began to treat sanitation as design rather than decoration, scribbling notes about pipes, slopes, and pressure in the margins of their treatises. The age that valued proportion could not ignore forever the imbalance between its splendour and its stench. Slowly, water began to return to the conversation, not yet in pipes, but in principle. By the 17th century, Europe had grown tired of pretending that perfume was plumbing. The fountain still sparkled and the wig still powdered, but beneath the silks and ceremony, a faint unease crept in. Cleanliness was beginning to change from a matter of fragrance to a matter of privacy. The same society that once relieved itself communally in Roman marble now preferred to look the other way, and the new virtue of the age was discretion. If the Renaissance masked its odour with roses, the Baroque era buried it under etiquette. Polite society began when people stopped sharing a sponge. The chamber pot, that most personal of objects, became the silent centrepiece of domestic life. Every household had one, china for the wealthy, pewter or wood for the rest, each discreetly stored beneath the bed or within an ornamental box. Servants emptied them into streets or cesspits at dawn, a daily ritual of denial that turned civility into choreography. Guests pretended not to notice the faint traces of ammonia in drawing rooms. To speak of such matters was to risk vulgarity. To pretend they did not exist was refinement. The more sophisticated the household, the more invisible its waste became. It was in this atmosphere of elegance and embarrassment that Sir John Harrington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, introduced what he called the Ajax, a clever play on Jakes, slang for toilet. Completed in 1596, his design used a cistern of water to flush waste through a valve into a sealed pit, a system as ingenious as it was premature. Harrington built one for himself and one for the Queen at Richmond Palace. The world was not ready for such honesty. The mechanism worked, but the mindset did not. Most people still considered running water and bodily functions incompatible companions. The flush toilet would wait nearly 2 centuries for its renaissance. For the moment, chamber pots continued to rule, joined by a new social accessory, the close stool. These portable thrones resembled furniture, high-backed chairs with padded seats and hinged lids, designed to disguise their purpose from polite company. Some were works of art, carved from mahogany and upholstered in velvet. Courtiers might hold conversations or even take audiences while seated upon them, etiquette demanding that everyone ignore the obvious. The absurdity escaped no one, but propriety demanded endurance. The age that prided itself on reason was profoundly irrational about plumbing. Meanwhile, outside the drawing rooms, the streets told a different story. London, Paris, and Amsterdam teemed with growth, but lacked drainage worthy of their ambitions. Cesspits overflowed into basements, open ditches carried filth toward rivers, already burdened with industry. In some neighbourhoods, human waste mixed freely with animal manure, creating a sludge that farmers collected for fertiliser. The polite world lived inches above this mire, separated by nothing but class and floorboards. Servants traversed the same streets that supplied the gentry's tables, and their boots told the story when they returned. Urban elegance was a theatre built over a sewer, yet even amid this chaos, a curious transformation was taking place. Modesty, once a moral concept, began to acquire a physical dimension. The body itself was being reclassified from public to private, from natural to potentially scandalous. Locks appeared on doors, curtains multiplied, manuals of manners advised readers to disguise every bodily noise. Privacy became a form of social currency, and the toilet, whether pot, stool, or primitive flush, became its temple. Cleanliness was no longer just the absence of dirt, it was the management of information. The 18th century raised this discretion to an art form. As Enlightenment thinkers celebrated progress and the dignity of man, they quietly designed rooms to ensure that dignity remained untested. Indoor toilets, still rare and unreliable, became fashionable among the elite. Early versions borrowed from Harrington's idea, combining valves, levers, and cisterns. The bowls were crafted from porcelain, smooth and bright as moral perfection. The materials reflected a cultural ideal, purity through polish. What soap and reason did for the mind, porcelain did for the posterior. These private conveniences became symbols of refinement, advertised in the same breath as mirrors and musical clocks. Plumbing, though rudimentary, entered the vocabulary of luxury. In England and France, inventors experimented with improved valves and siphons, while porcelain manufacturers in Meissen and Sèvres competed to make the most graceful basins. Some nobles decorated their toilets with pastoral scenes or cherubs, as if to reassure themselves that even nature approved. The closer sanitation came to functioning properly, the less anyone wanted to discuss it. Civilization's progress was measured by how quietly it flushed. This new obsession with appearances extended far beyond the bathroom. Streets remained filthy, but facades grew cleaner. Municipal ordinances ordered the removal of waste while ignoring the lack of disposal systems. The air still carried the same sour mixture of smoke, dung and decay, yet polite society declared the age enlightened. In the contradiction lay the century's character. Reason above, rot below. When philosophers wrote about the social contract, they never mentioned who emptied the pots. Even the emerging science of health reflected this polite hypocrisy. Doctors warned against miasmas, the invisible vapours thought to spread disease. Yet they treated the symptoms of filth without addressing its causes. People sprinkled vinegar on floors, burned incense in parlours, and washed their hands in perfume basins, believing that good smell equaled good health. The result was not cleanliness, but confidence, an illusion that civility itself could sterilise the world. The cultural shift toward modesty had unintended consequences. Privacy improved, but sanitation lagged. Chamber pots were emptied less openly, leading to more indoor contamination. Cesspits sealed for discretion leaked into wells. The act of hiding filth made it harder to remove. By making the body unspeakable, society had made it unsolvable. Progress retreated behind closed doors, where servants continued to manage what philosophy preferred to ignore. Still, the pieces of true innovation were falling into place. In 1775, Alexander Cumming patented a new version of the flush toilet, featuring an S-shaped trap that used standing water to block odours, a refinement that finally made domestic plumbing feasible. Other inventors followed. Joseph Bramah with his improved valve system, and later Thomas Twyford, whose all-ceramic models would define the modern form. The world was learning that technology could do what manners could not. The Enlightenment had given humanity reason and refinement, but the 19th century gave it consequences. Cities that had once prided themselves on manners and marble now had to confront their own physical reality: waste, disease, and population density colliding under the weight of progress. Industrialization transformed towns into engines of labour and consumption, each fueled by coal and fed by bodies. The same steam that powered factories condensed on walls blackened with soot, streets filled with workers, horses, and refuse until they became rivers of mud. The polite illusion of cleanliness that had sustained the 18th century could not survive the factory whistle. The modern world was being built from the ground up, and what lay beneath it demanded attention. Nowhere did this reckoning arrive more dramatically than in London. By mid-century, the city had swollen to more than 2 million inhabitants, each producing what polite society preferred not to quantify. Cesspits overflowed, gutters ran thick with runoff, and the Thames, once a symbol of commerce and empire, had become a slow-moving, open sewer. The river's current carried not just filth, but death. Repeated outbreaks of cholera, beginning in 1831, exposed the cost of ignoring sanitation. At first, authorities blamed miasmas, the foul vapours thought to rise from decay. It was easier to condemn bad air than bad policy. Physicians and politicians spoke eloquently about public virtue, while standing over rivers that bubbled with human waste. The crisis reached its crescendo in the summer of 1858, when an unusually hot spell turned the Thames into something biblical. The heat intensified the stench until it overwhelmed Parliament itself. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime failed to mask the odour. Legislators fled their chambers, unable to sit through sessions, as the river's exhalations crept through every window. Newspapers called it the Great Stink. What perfume and pretense had hidden for centuries could no longer be ignored. The capital of the modern world smelled like its conscience. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer with the temperament of an accountant and the imagination of an artist. Appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, he faced a task both monumental and unglamorous: to give the city new arteries. His plan called for roughly 80 miles of intercepting sewers running parallel to the Thames, capturing waste before it reached the river and redirecting it downstream. It was a system of astonishing scale, brick tunnels large enough for a carriage to pass through, all built with gradients precise enough to carry the flow by gravity alone. Each curve, each brick, each vent was a triumph of order over entropy. London would finally do what Rome had done 2 millennia earlier: build morality out of masonry. Construction began in 1859 and continued for nearly 2 decades, employing tens of thousands of labourers. They dug, laid and mortared through clay, sand and centuries of buried filth. Bazalgette, anticipating future growth, designed the tunnels twice as large as necessary. His foresight saved London from disaster more than once. When completed, the system carried both waste and storm water through massive conduits to pumping stations at Crossness and Abbey Mills, where great engines lifted the flow into the river far beyond the city limits. It was functional and beautiful, a cathedral turned inside out. The Great Stink ended not with perfume, but with engineering. Civilization finally built its conscience out of brick. The impact was immediate. Cholera outbreaks declined sharply once clean water and effective drainage separated the living from their waste. The invisible connection between sanitation and survival became visible at last. Public health ceased to be a private responsibility and became a civic mission. The same moral energy that had once built churches now built sewers. Hygiene turned from personal virtue into public infrastructure. To clean the city was to redeem it. Newspapers celebrated Bazalgette's system as an act of salvation, proof that progress could be measured not just in invention, but in compassion. London was not alone. Across Europe and America, industrial cities followed its example. Paris, under Baron Haussmann, rebuilt its boulevards with underground tunnels, vast enough to tour by boat. New York, Chicago, and Berlin laid networks of pipes that mirrored their street grids. Sewer covers became symbols of modernity, cast in iron like civic crests. Engineers achieved what theologians could not. They connected humanity. The same water that cleansed one district passed beneath another, binding rich and poor in a single circulatory system. Sanitation was democracy in its purest form, unseen but shared. The new sewers also changed how people imagined morality. Cleanliness was no longer proof of divine favour, but of civic pride. To live in a hygienic city was to participate in civilization itself. Governments that once ignored filth now legislated against it. Boards of health, water commissions, and building codes emerged as the bureaucratic offspring of fear and enlightenment. Engineers became the new priests of the urban age. Their sermons, written in pressure and flow. The purification of cities mirrored the purification of conscience. Progress had become practical. For all its triumph, the sanitation revolution had its blind spots. The same pipes that carried waste away also carried complacency. The poor remained crowded in tenements, where drains leaked and wells turned foul. Clean water reached drawing rooms faster than slums. And while the new sewers removed the smell, they did not erase memory. The industrial city still produced filth faster than it could process it. Only now, the evidence was hidden underground. Humanity had buried its waste and called it virtue. Even so, the moral geography of the world had changed. The link between cleanliness and compassion, between engineering and empathy, became one of the century's great achievements. Public health reformers like Edwin Chadwick in Britain and Florence Nightingale in the Crimea argued that sanitation was not just science but justice. A clean city was a humane one, and the pipes beneath its streets were arteries of equality. The humble flush had become a civic sacrament, connecting every household to a shared infrastructure of decency. By the turn of the 20th century, the war against smell had been won so decisively that people stopped noticing the battlefield. The pipes that once symbolized salvation became ordinary fixtures of life, their miracles hidden behind plaster and tile. What had begun as engineering evolved into expectation, water on demand, warmth at will, cleanliness assumed as birthright. The flush, once an emblem of civilization's progress, now disappeared into background noise. A polite click, a brief rush and silence. The 20th century's greatest luxury wasn't gold or flight, it was forgetting what came next. The first sign of this new comfort was standardization. Industrial production, that great democratizer of both goods and habits, made plumbing universal. Houses and apartments were built with pipes already in place, bathrooms designed not as afterthoughts, but as domestic centerpieces. The sink, the bathtub, and the toilet became the trinity of modern hygiene, each connected to a hidden network that functioned so reliably it seemed natural. Clean water arrived, waste vanished. Children grew up thinking it had always been so. Civilization's most sophisticated machinery became invisible by design. Architects and manufacturers treated the bathroom as both utility and aspiration. In early decades, fixtures were proudly mechanical, metal pipes exposed, porcelain gleaming like an industrial altar. Later, design softened the edges, curves replaced joints, and colour arrived in the form of pastel bathtubs and mint green tiles. The bathroom became the most private room in the house, yet also the one most obsessed with presentation. To decorate it was to deny its purpose, a kind of aesthetic censorship. The ideal bathroom looked untouched, as though no one had ever used it. Cleanliness became a performance of absence. Advertising sealed this illusion. Soap companies, toothpaste brands, and detergent manufacturers transformed sanitation into virtue. Posters showed smiling families beside spotless sinks, suggesting that moral worth could be measured in lather. The same century that witnessed world wars and atomic fire also perfected the slogan, "Kills 99.9% of germs." Hygiene became a kind of faith, quantified, confident, and evangelical. Bathrooms gleamed in magazine spreads as temples of domestic control. The promise was simple: buy purity, install it, and never think about it again. This aesthetic of forgetting extended beyond the home. Cities buried their sewers deeper, sealed manholes tighter, and sent their treatment plants to the edges of the map. Engineers refined the systems until failure became rare enough to feel impossible. The connection between body and infrastructure, once intimate and unavoidable, now passed through polished valves and anonymous grids. People stopped being participants in sanitation and became its beneficiaries. The flow of water in and out of the house mirrored the flow of information through a wire, seamless, silent, invisible. With this invisibility came new taboos. The more civilized the bathroom became, the less anyone wished to speak of it. Social etiquette drew a discreet curtain over bodily function. Language softened, bathroom instead of toilet, restroom instead of latrine. To discuss waste was to breach decorum. To acknowledge it, unnecessary. The pipes carried not just sewage, but denial, a constant stream of edited reality beneath polished floors. Modern psychology quietly noted the shift. The divide between what was expelled and what was expressed became cultural as well as biological. Cleanliness, once communal, now turned inward. People took comfort in control, the flush as small proof that disorder could be made to vanish. The ritual of washing hands, of disinfecting surfaces, became gestures of reassurance against a world that refused to stay contained. To be modern was to live in permanent maintenance, polishing away reminders of decay. Even design language mirrored this retreat from awareness. Mid-century bathrooms favoured smooth enamel and hidden joints. A visual vocabulary of concealment. Plumbing was no longer art, it was architecture's secret. Engineers chased perfection. Silent fill valves, odour traps, self-cleaning surfaces. The goal was not just function, but erasure. The ideal modern bathroom was soundless and scentless. A chamber where matter vanished without trace. Civilization, having conquered filth, now pursued its annihilation. Yet beneath the gloss, the same old systems continued to breathe. Water still obeyed gravity. Waste still relied on fall and flow. Each modern flush followed the same principle the Sumerians discovered with their clay drains. Only the materials had changed. Lead replaced by copper, brick by concrete, superstition by indifference. The triumph of the 20th century lay not in new invention, but in concealment. The miracle was hidden underfoot, disguised by convenience. Progress had succeeded so completely that it made itself invisible. The cultural psychology of sanitation shifted accordingly. What had once been a matter of civic pride became private anxiety. Advertisements promised deodorants, disinfectants, and air fresheners, an entire economy built on the fear of returning smell. Modern people washed their hands compulsively, not from filth, but from unease. The very success of plumbing bred a kind of fragility. A single clog, a burst pipe, or a water outage could shatter the illusion of control. In the century that invented skyscrapers and spaceflight, people still panicked when the toilet failed to flush. Civilization, it turned out, remained only as stable as its valves. This illusion of purity shaped more than hygiene. It shaped identity. Clean lines, clean language, clean living. The vocabulary of modernity echoed the plumbing beneath it. To be modern was to forget the past, to build over it in tile and chrome. Architects called it functionalism. Psychologists called it repression. Either way, it worked. The world above the pipes was radiant with self-assurance, its inhabitants convinced that cleanliness was their natural condition. Only when the system faltered did the truth rise, quietly and unmistakably, through the floorboards. By the end of the century, the transformation was complete. The bathroom had become an art object. The toilet, a design statement. Plumbing was both infrastructure and metaphor, a hidden network sustaining an oblivious civilization. The same faith that once filled churches now filled water tanks, sustaining the quiet miracle of removal. People no longer needed to pray for purity. They could simply purchase it. The 20th century had perfected the illusion of cleanliness. The 21st began to notice the bill. Beneath the tiles, the pipes kept humming, quietly moving the evidence of daily life from one unseen chamber to another. The system had become so reliable, so normal, that few ever stopped to wonder what it consumed in return. Modern plumbing made cleanliness look infinite, but it was built on finite resources: water, energy, and space, and on a global network whose benefits were distributed with spectacular inequality. Comfort had a pipeline. Civilization still leaks. In the developed world, sanitation became a triumph of automation. Wastewater treatment plants rose at the edges of cities, operating like anonymous fortresses of cleanliness. Inside a process older than civilization itself, sedimentation and decay was orchestrated with industrial precision. Solids settled in tanks, microbes digested what humans could not, and chemical treatments bleached the residue into something fit to release back into the environment. The resulting effluent ran clear, odorless, and deceptively innocent. Each day, billions of gallons were processed this way, proof that the modern city could turn its bowels into an engineering masterpiece. Sewage had become science, and science, as always, hid its smell behind complexity. But perfection was selective. In much of the world, the pipe stopped at the border of privilege. While skyscrapers flushed with confidence, over 2 billion people still lived without access to safe sanitation. Open defecation, long banished from the industrial imagination, remained a reality across rural Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. In these places, water was too precious to waste on waste, and the ancient compromise between hygiene and scarcity endured. Diseases that the developed world had all but forgotten, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, still thrived where infrastructure did not. To be without plumbing in the modern age was to live outside civilization's invisible perimeter. International efforts tried to bridge the gap. Governments and aid organizations installed pit latrines, composting toilets, and decentralized treatment systems. Each success was fragile, dependent on maintenance, funding, and cultural fit. Sanitation required more than pipes. It required permanence, and permanence cost money. The irony of the modern era was that the same materials that made plumbing possible, cement, copper, and energy, were also the commodities least available to those who needed them most. Clean water, the oldest civil right, remained a luxury in vast parts of the world. Civilization's promise had reached only half its population. Even where sanitation succeeded, the cost was rarely visible. The modern treatment plant is an energy-hungry machine, consuming electricity to move aerate, and sterilize. Wastewater carries traces of everything civilization creates: pharmaceuticals, microplastics, industrial chemicals, hormones, and heavy metals. No amount of chlorination or filtration can fully erase what modernity adds to its own runoff. The system that protects us from disease now leaks a subtler contamination, one not of smell or sight, but of scale. Humanity's waste has gone molecular. Rivers downstream of great cities shimmer faintly with compounds that never existed before humans learned to synthesize them. Meanwhile, the very abundance of water-based sanitation strains the planet's resources. Every flush consumes several litres of treated drinking water, water purified at great cost only to be used for disposal. Cities facing drought must weigh the ethics of hygiene against survival. Engineers propose vacuum toilets, grey water recycling, and zero discharge systems, while environmentalists call for a cultural reimagining of cleanliness itself. For the first time since Mesopotamia, the question has returned: how much water is civilization worth? Technology offers glimpses of a different future. Advanced treatment facilities in countries like Singapore and Sweden recycle wastewater into potable new water, so pure that it unnerves the public. Composting toilets, long dismissed as rustic, reappear in sustainable architecture, their efficiency disguised under sleek design. Engineers design smart sensors that monitor flows, detecting leaks before they flood basements. These systems are impressive, but they also reveal how fragile the network remains. A single blackout or storm can cripple treatment plants, reminding everyone how thin the barrier truly is between order and overflow. Culturally, plumbing remains a kind of faith, trusted absolutely, questioned rarely. The modern citizen flushes and forgets, confident that invisible hands will handle the rest. The infrastructure beneath the feet of billions is a labyrinth of steel and concrete, tunnels vast enough to rival the cathedrals built above them. Few ever see these spaces except maintenance crews, who descend into them like miners of modern virtue. Down there, the myth of progress hums audibly, pumps whirring, filters sighing, valves clicking like mechanical prayer beads. The pipes have become civilization's unconscious, processing its secrets in the dark. Yet the illusion of mastery persists only because the system remains hidden. Environmental collapse, flooding, and industrial waste all test its limits. Heavy rains overwhelm drains built for smaller centuries. Coastal cities watch seawater creep backward through their sewers. In wealthier nations, treatment plants battle aging infrastructure, much of it a century old. The same societies that pride themselves on efficiency still depend on gravity and pipework designed by men who wore top hats. Progress has become maintenance at scale. And still, comfort insists on denial. The gleaming bathroom upstairs seems unrelated to the wastewater plant downstream. The clean tap ignores the reservoir that feeds it. Sanitation has become so seamless that its existence feels abstract. To be modern is to live atop a miracle, so well disguised it seems like nature. But nature never promised permanence. Pipes corrode, energy grids falter, and rivers remember everything we pour into them. Beneath the city's grid of lights lies another map entirely, a vast circulatory system of waste, water, and history, endlessly moving, never clean for long. Civilization has always measured itself in monuments, but its truest reflection has always been underground. The story of humanity is less about conquest or culture than about cooperation, the slow, stubborn effort to manage what it creates. Every invention, every empire, every act of art or industry produces residue, and survival depends on what happens next. The humble systems that carry waste away have always been the clearest proof of collective intelligence, not the brilliance of a few, but the steady labour of many. Waste management has also shaped the invisible parts of civilization, its manners, its morals, its sense of shame. Every age has built barriers between itself and its filth, turning necessity into ritual, ritual into privacy, and privacy into denial. From Mesopotamian drains to modern plumbing, the effort to distance ourselves from our own bodies has defined what we call progress. Toilets mark the boundary between comfort and chaos, between what humanity admits and what it hides. They are the machines of humility, reminding us that even the most powerful among us share the same fragile biology. To study their history is to see the mirror beneath civilization, a reflection not of triumph, but of persistence. The same gravity that pulls water through pipes pulls societies toward order. Every drain is an act of faith, a belief that decay can be contained and that cooperation can overcome entropy for another day. When we flush, we participate in a lineage older than writing, the collective decision to confront what we'd rather forget. Civilization's true hero is not the conqueror or the artist, but the engineer who made coexistence tolerable. Every empire rises for glory, but survives for plumbing. The channels beneath our cities hum with the same quiet purpose they always have, carrying away what we no longer need so that life above can continue unspoiled. Listen long enough in any city and you can still hear it, the faint echo of water flowing through darkness, a soft applause for our ongoing attempt at order. It is continuity made audible, humility made mechanical, the sound of the unseen network that holds the world together. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.